is a precedent-based map of likely next moves, grounded strictly in what has already happened in comparable situations. Wet'suwet'en 10, Quebec referenda, Alberta referendum litigation, treaty enforcement cases, and what is now formally on the record after the Chiefs' non-confidence vote. I will separate high-probability moves from contingent moves and flag what triggers each step. I am not speculating intent. This is a pattern analysis based on precedent. Likely next moves based on precedent. Phase 1. Immediate political containment. Days. Weeks. 1. Provincial response. De-escalation in language, not policy. Precedent. After court losses or Indigenous unified actions, Alberta governments historically shift tone without changing trajectory, e.g., post-court referendum ruling, post-treaty litigation. Likely actions. Public statements affirming respect for treaties. Reiteration that Section 35 remains unchanged. Framing the Chiefs' vote as political disagreement rather than constitutional crisis. What they will not do, based on precedent. Withdraw referendum enabling legislation. Acknowledge breach of treaty obligations. Pause separation adjacent processes. Source grounding. CBC and APTN coverage shows identical language used after the court ruled a separation referendum unconstitutional, while the province continued altering referendum rules. CBC. +1. 2. Federal response. Quiet engagement, no immediate public confrontation. Precedent. Federal governments historically avoid public intergovernmental conflict unless litigation is imminent. Likely actions. Private correspondence from PMO acknowledging Chief's letter. Internal Department of Justice and Crown Indigenous Relations risk assessments. Behind-the-scenes pressure on Alberta to avoid escalation. What triggers escalation? A referendum date being set. A provincial act explicitly asserting authority over treaty lands. Source grounding. The Chief's letter places the federal crown on notice, activating the honor of the Crown Doctrine, which historically precedes federal legal intervention rather than immediate political action. CBC. +1. Phase 2. Legal hardening, weeks, months. 3. Treaty nations shift from political to legal posture. Precedent. When governments ignore unified Indigenous political action, litigation follows, e.g., Wet'suwet'en 10, Mikisew Cree, Grassy Narrows. Likely actions. Coordinated preemptive injunctions if referendum machinery advances. Constitutional references asserting. Treaties predate Alberta. Referenda cannot extinguish treaty obligations. Notices to industry warning of title and consent risk. Why this matters. Courts have already ruled that Alberta separation initiatives violate treaty rights and Section 35. New filings would rely on existing precedent, not novel arguments. App News. 4. Industry risk recalculation, quiet but fast. Precedent. Industry responds to legal uncertainty faster than governments. Likely actions. Delayed capital commitments on treaty land. Pressure on the province from energy and finance sectors. Increased demand for federal assurances. Source grounding. Chief Alan Adam explicitly warned industry could be tied up in court for decades, language identical to prior successful leverage strategies. Cradio. Phase 3. Economic narrative escalation, parallel track. 5. Deficit and debt framing intensifies. Precedent. Separatist movements rely on fiscal grievance narratives during economic downturns. What we already know, not speculation. Alberta is projecting multi-year deficits beyond this year. Resource royalty volatility is increasing. Tax cuts were implemented ahead of revenue decline. Likely actions. Increased messaging about Ottawa drain. Framing treaty obligations as constraints on recovery. Linking deficits to federal regulation and court decisions. Source grounding. Budget analyses confirm multi-year deficits and shrinking fiscal buffers, creating fertile ground for grievance-based mobilization. TD. +1. Phase 4. Referendum pressure points if triggered. 6. If a referendum proceeds, immediate court intervention. Precedent. Every modern secession attempt in Canada has ended in judicial review before a vote. What courts have already said? Referenda that ignore treaty rights are unconstitutional. Treaties are part of Canada's constitutional architecture. Provinces cannot legislate around constitutional review. Outcome likelihood. White heavy check mark, high probability of injunction or nullification. Cross mark, low probability of referendum surviving judicial scrutiny. Source grounding. Court of King's Bench rulings and Supreme Court doctrine are explicit on this point. App News. +1. Phase 5. Federal. Provincial constitutional clash. Worst case scenario. 7. Federal assertion of Crown authority. Rare but precedent. Trigger conditions. Provincial defiance of court rulings. Attempt to operationalize separation on treaty land. Breakdown of honor of the Crown obligations. Possible actions. Federal reference to Supreme Court. Withholding cooperation under constitutional authority. Direct federal, Indigenous treaty enforcement mechanisms. Why this matters. This is the scenario the Chiefs are trying to prevent, not provoke. Strategic reality check, plain language. Alberta cannot lawfully separate without First Nations consent. Treaties cannot be overridden by referendum, deficit, or province. Every legal path favors treaty nations, not the province. The longer the province pushes, the more leverage shifts to First Nations. This is why the Chiefs acted now, before the narrative calcifies. What to watch next? Early warning signals. If you see any of the following, escalation is imminent. A referendum date announced. New legislation asserting provincial sovereignty language. Direct challenges to federal jurisdiction over treaties. Industry warnings about legal instability. If you want, next I can. Translate this into a one-page briefing for community.
We're good for now.